This shutdown will devastate the small communities in my district. I call on my House colleagues to stop the games and get to work to restart government. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Generally yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Woodall, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the time. I have a heavy heart about this issue, as I know many of my colleagues do. In fact, I haven't bumped into one of the 432 of us who's enthusiastic about the situation that we're in. Though I'll tell you, Mr. Speaker, one of the things that is most troubling to me is the decision to define success as passing a CR that the Senate is dictating. And I don't say that because it's the Senate. I say that because my constituency back home doesn't care about CRs. CR is a continuing resolution, as you know, Mr. Speaker, and the only time a continuing resolution comes to the floor of this House is when this House has already failed to do the job it was supposed to do, and that's passing appropriations bills, Mr. Speaker. That's appropriating through 12 different bills, one step at a time, making those decisions about spending priorities for the nation. And it is fascinating to me, Mr. Speaker, because it has been years since this House has gone through that process, not through any fault of this House, but because we have absolutely no activity on the Senate side. Again, it somehow is getting defined today as if you do things piecemeal, that you're somehow doing something wrong. Again, that's regular order. Doing things one bill at the time is normal. That's what's supposed to happen. You're supposed to make individual decisions on individual bills. Last year, the House passed 7 different appropriations bills, Mr. Speaker, one step at the time, the way the government is supposed to be funded. Senate passed 1, and thus the process broke down. No appropriations bills were passed. We've been funding the government through these continuing resolutions. Well, here we are again. This year, Mr. Speaker, House has worked on 5 appropriations bills. The Senate has passed 0. And so we are here where we are today because the Senate hasn't been able to move anything at all. It is with a heavy heart that I hear my colleagues say we could reopen services for veterans, but we're not going to do it because we have a better plan that we ought to do everything at once. If we can't help everybody, we don't want to help anybody. I don't believe that's actually the sentiment of my friends on the other side of the aisle. In fact, Mr. Speaker, in June of this year, we came together. We came together in this House, only 4 votes against a Veterans Affairs Appropriations Bills. 4 votes in this entire U.S. House of Representatives voted no. Everyone else voted yes, and that bill, which fully funds all of our veteran services, in fact, pluses up the funding for our veteran services, not for 3 months, not for 3 weeks, but for the entire fiscal year, we passed that in June, Mr. Speaker, and it sits in the Senate dusty today, having received no attention since June. Folks, I don't know about your constituents, Mr. Speaker. My constituents want us to get something done. They understand there are things that we disagree about, but isn't there more that unites us than divides us? And I tell you that there is. I'm absolutely certain that there is. And if the only way we can find it is to move one small piece of legislation at the time, that may not be the most efficient way to do it, but if that gets the job done, let's get the job done. Mr. Speaker, I'm tired of excuses, and I'm tired of the blame. The Rules Committee is going to report out a rule today that is going to bring these provisions back to the House floor, an opportunity to open up those parks that my colleague was talking about just a few minutes ago, an opportunity to serve our veterans, an opportunity to deal with the important research at NIH, and on and on. Let's find those things we agree on. Let's get something done. We can do it, Mr. Speaker. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Moran, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this Republican shutdown is an outrageous abdication of Congress's responsibility. And it didn't need to be this way. In fact, if the House leadership were to call up a clean, continuing resolution appropriations bill today, it would pass. There are a sufficient number of votes from both sides of the political aisle to pass the measure. So far, however, the House Republican leadership has refused to do so, afraid of extremists within its own caucus, the so-called Ted Cruz Tea Party faction, whose demand is to shut down the government until the Affordable Care Act is either repealed or delayed. And so the American people's government has shut down. 90% of the employees of the Environmental Protection Agency have been furloughed. 84% of the employees of the Department of Interior, all over the country, but mostly in the western states, have all been furloughed. 70% of the employees of our essential intelligence agencies have now been furloughed. Recipients of the Women and Infant Care Program, the most vulnerable mothers and children, have had their livelihoods jeopardized. The National Institutes of Health have had to turn away 30 children with cancer from clinical trials. We in this House must end this shutdown. This debate isn't even about the budget. The President and the Senate have already agreed to trillions of dollars of cuts set by the so-called Ryan Republican budget. Even though this draconian budget will endanger basic government operations, it'll disinvest in our children's future, and it'll trigger even more federal employee furloughs and possible rifts. Rather, this shutdown is about a measure that strengthens insurance coverage for the roughly 260 million Americans who have insurance. It will also eliminate pre-existing conditions and lifetime limits and makes health insurance available and affordable to roughly 40 million uninsured Americans through state exchanges where insurance companies compete to provide coverage, and through expansion of the Medicaid program. The Affordable Care Act is the law of the land. It has been affirmed as constitutional by the Republican-dominated Supreme Court and by a 5 million vote majority of the American people, with the defeat of the presidential candidate who promised to repeal it less than a year ago. Regardless of where one may stand on the issue of the Affordable Care Act, aka Obamacare, our democratic process for enacting laws and setting policy should not be held hostage to the threat of a government shutdown. It sets a terrible precedent for the future. My Republican colleagues continue to demand concessions with serious long-term consequences in exchange for funding a spending bill for just a relatively few more days, another 45 days or so. They want long-term concessions at their preferred inadequate spending levels. What unreasonable demands will be made when this latest CR expires in 2 months or 1 month? These attempts to overturn the Democratic results of the last election by threat-making and hostage-taking must end now. We should do our job, fund the government, and we should remove the looming threat to the global economy in the form of the expiration of the debt ceiling, which will occur just in a couple of weeks. Not content with the economic destruction and hardship wrought by their government shutdown and their refusal to let the federal government play its historic role to stimulate a strong economic recovery, House Republicans continue to threaten the full faith and credit of the United States. As President Obama noted, if the tables were turned and you had a Republican president and a Democratic speaker, as you did during the Reagan administration, neither Speaker O'Neill nor the American people would tolerate what is going on today. And in fact, that's the situation that we have today, a broken Congress, a situation where the American people's voice isn't heard or represented. It's time for us to heed the American people, to let the majority of this
Gentleman's time
Congress
has
determine
expired.
public policy. Let's stop the extremism. Let's be responsible.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Let's pass this continuing resolution clean. Get on
now-
with the business of the government. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from North Carolina, Ms. Fox, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know that the American people are watching what's happening in Washington these days with a little more than a passing interest. And I'm sure they wonder sometimes about where is the truth, because they hear folks on one side of the aisle saying one thing and folks on the other side of the aisle saying another thing. When I talk to people at home, and I do my best to explain the situation in Washington right now, I try to point out the fact that we have deep philosophical differences in this body and in the Senate. And we do have two parts of our legislative branch of government, the House and the Senate, and the philosophical differences are pretty strong in both bodies. They really stem from the beginning of the country, and our founders felt very strongly, the majority of them though, that the federal government should be weak. We obviously had just come off of getting our independence from Britain, and we wanted to not have a king, and we wanted not to have a strong central government. I think the founders were right. And the founders in the Constitution outlined the duties of our respective branches of government. They enumerated them. People will talk about enumerated powers. And they made those powers very few for the federal government. And they emphasized that with the 10th Amendment. And it said, if we didn't tell the federal government to do this in the Constitution, then we don't want the federal government to do it. We leave those responsibilities to the states and to the individuals. And you know, we've gotten along very well. We did get along very well following the Constitution for a long time in this country. And then we came about in the 1930s with an era of great involvement by the federal government. In my opinion, and the opinion of many of my colleagues, overstepping its bounds by getting involved in things that are not mentioned in the Constitution. Bring us forward to the 1960s, a period of great activism in this country when many more programs were begun that, in the opinion of many of us, again, had absolutely no place in the federal government. We should not be doing things like running the education of this country out of the federal government or running health care out of the federal government. So what we have here is the result of these deep philosophical differences. And I want to say that that's what's playing out here. And those of us who are opposed to the federal government running health care in this country do so not out of pettiness, not out of meanness, not out of lack of concern for our fellow citizens, but because we want to diminish the role of the federal government in our lives. We believe that once you turn health care over to the federal government, you've basically turned the lives of citizens over to the federal government, and that is not a good place to be. Our colleagues on the other side of the aisle also act as though no act of Congress has ever been repealed. My goodness, we spend a good part of our days here repealing bad legislation that somehow or another got passed before. And so what we're doing, what we have been doing for the last few days, is making every effort we can to repeal or delay what is called the Affordable Health Care Act, which we are finding out is absolutely not affordable. And so that's what we've been doing. but we've been unsuccessful, so we're trying to keep the government open. We've passed bill after bill after bill out of the House to keep the federal government open. We have failed in doing that in a large way, so we're working at doing it in minor ways by passing individual bills. And that's what we're here to do today. I just came out of the Rules Committee. We had these bills on the floor yesterday, 3 of the 5 that we're going to vote on today. And our colleagues on the other side of the aisle voted against paying our Guard, paying the National Guard, even though the President sort of quietly Saturday night signed a bill to continue to pay our troops. That was a bill the President said he'd never sign. He wouldn't compromise. He wouldn't negotiate, and yet he did that. Now we want to keep our national parks open. We want to pay our National Guard and Reserve people. We want to provide local funding for the District of Columbia, and we want to keep our promises to America's veterans. With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Jeffries, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I arrived in this institution after spending 6 years in the New York State Legislature. It was a very meaningful experience for me, notwithstanding the fact that the legislature in New York is sometimes derided as one of the more dysfunctional bodies in the country. But after witnessing the last few days here in the House of Representatives, it's clear to me that there is no more dysfunctional place in this country than the House of Representatives under the current majority control. This is a manufactured crisis that has unnecessarily plunged us into a painful government shutdown, a shutdown that will harm the American people. The House majority has placed children in jeopardy, tens of thousands shut out of the Head Start program. The House majority has placed seniors in jeopardy, unable to benefit from the Meals on Wheels program, partially funded by the federal government. The House majority, with this government shutdown, has placed expectant mothers in jeopardy, individuals unable to get the nutritional assistance that might otherwise be available. You've placed veterans in jeopardy, Mr. Speaker. The House majority has placed families in jeopardy. More than 800,000 hard-working civil servants cast out onto the streets, unable with uncertainty to determine when they may be able to pay their bills. The House majority, with this government shutdown, has placed the economy of the American people in jeopardy. Enough is enough. And, you know, I'm trying to figure out who actually is in charge. Mr. Speaker, are you in control of your conference on the other side of the aisle? Is it the Tea Party that is in control of the House of Representatives' agenda? Is it outside agitators, the junior senator from Texas who barks out orders on the other side of the aisle, and then they're executed in lockstep by the extremists here in the House of Representatives? Mr. Speaker, who's in charge? Who's responsible on your side of the aisle for marching us down this dangerous path? I've also been struggling to try and figure out, why are you so angry about the Affordable Care Act? What is it that you're so upset about? Are you angry about the fact that tens of millions of previously uninsured Americans will have access to health care? Are you upset about the fact that the law will prevent discrimination against individuals, including children with pre-existing conditions? Are you angry about the fact that the Medicare Part D donut hole will be closed and Seniors all across America will have access to more robust prescription drug coverage. Are you angry about the fact that young people in a difficult economy can stay on their parents' health insurance plan until the age of 26? What exactly are you upset about? Are you angry about the fact that small businesses will have access to tax credits as much as 35% in order to ensure their employees in a manner that will help these small businesses grow and prosper? Enough already. The Affordable Care Act is the law of the land. It was passed by a duly elected Congress in 2010 with the great leadership of Nancy Pelosi and Harry Reid. You've lost legislatively, Mr. Speaker. The Affordable Care Act was determined to be constitutional by the Supreme Court of the United States of America in an opinion written by Chief Justice John Roberts, an individual nominated by George W. Bush. You've lost legally. And then the President of the United States of America was re-elected last November in an electoral college landslide. You've lost politically, Mr. Speaker. Enough already. Why are we in this situation? I would simply ask that we pass a clean CR and get back to doing the business of the American people.
Chair now recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Pittinger, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, we were elected to be representatives, to represent our districts, to represent our constituents, to listen and to respond. Mr. Speaker, I've been listening. I've been listening to phone calls. I've been reading emails. I've been hearing what my constituents have to say. And I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, they are deeply concerned. They're concerned with the direction of our country. Yes, they're concerned with a body that can't seem to come together, that can't seem to listen to each other. One of them wrote me just today, said, "I have watched with great interest the ongoing debate between the House and the Senate regarding the federal health care law. Quite frankly, I was of the opinion that an absolute stand by the House of Representatives to defund Obamacare was an inappropriate step as compared to less drastic measures. However, in the mail today, I received a 92% proposed increase from Blue Cross Blue Shield for our current plan for 2014. The explanation of the increase all boiled down to the changes in the insurance markets required as a result of the full implementation of Obamacare. You can easily understand why we are astounded that this is the best health care direction that our country can embark upon. I encourage you to take whatever opportunities come your way to stop this disaster that is looming. The financial impact on people who are not a drain on the government will be immense." Here's another one, Mr. Speaker. I just received a letter from Blue Cross Blue Shield informing me that my current coverage has been outlawed by Obamacare, and the premium for my family will increase by 400%. If I switch to a legal coverage option, this increase is over $9,000 a year. I don't care if you have to risk shutting down the government or defaulting on the debt. It is just postponing the inevitable default of Obamacare is allowed to exist. Well, Mr. Speaker, we're not here because we want to shut down the government. We've made every effort possible. We have gone at great lengths, the extra mile, to the other side, to present to them alternatives, to present to them ways that we could come together and agree. We had 3 proposals there on the table. Now we've offered to go and sit down and talk. That's what our body does. When we come to disagreements between the House and the Senate, our formal agreement is to come and we meet. We confer. We bring in negotiators. We talk. We try to reason this out. We do this in our families, don't we? And that's what's done in this body on a normal course of business. However, Mr. Speaker, in our efforts of trying to bring resolution and sound reasoning to this process, we can't get a response. They say, no, we don't want to talk to you. We don't want to reason to you. We don't want to hear what your constituents are saying. We don't want to hear the problems. We just want to ram this through. Where is that in a representative government? Where is that in being responsive to the American people? Mr. Speaker, if we really want good policy, and I have to believe that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle truly want good policy, then we need to take politics out of this. We need to take self-service out of this. We need to come together like adults and sit down and talk this through and come up with a reasonable solution that would bring the best outcome for the American people. That's what our hope is. We invite, still today, the leadership of the Senate to come and to sit down in the conference with us, to negotiate with us, to lay out their concerns and their thoughts. Let's be adults. Let's do the right thing for the American people. Thank you. I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Alabama, Ms. Soule, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I take to the floor with a heavy heart that is disappointed, frustrated, and frankly outraged by our government shutdown. Once again, we have let partisan politics, we've put it ahead of the needs of the American people. And as I stand before you this morning, millions of Americans are already suffering the consequences at the hands of a dysfunctional Congress. The legislative process that has resulted in this shutdown reflects a neglect of the responsibilities that we were sent here to meet. The House majority had a chance to avert the government shutdown, but chose political brinkmanship over responsible compromise. In order to avoid the shutdown earlier this week, the Senate sent the House a bill, a compromise spending bill, which accepted the Republicans' lower funding levels. Instead of allowing a clean funding bill to come to this floor, the House majority once again attached unreasonable amendments which had no hope of gaining bipartisan support. Now, House Republicans want to partially open the federal government, cherry-picking winners and losers. This is no way to run a government. Think about it. If we and all of the small businesses and big businesses out there would run their institutions the way we run this Congress, our economy would be in shambles. Now, I hate to play the blame game, Mr. Speaker, but this government shutdown is solely the responsibility and the creation of House Republicans. We have tried to compromise, but Republicans time and time again have put on the floor re-debating, using America's tax-paying money to re-debate again and again the Affordable Care Act. Now, people say that House Democrats and the Senate and the President should compromise on this. Well, how do you extend a hand to a clenched fist? You cannot compromise when the other side is not willing to accept the fact that the Affordable Care Act is the law of the land. It has been debated. It has been voted on. It has been found to be constitutional. Let's just get on with the American people's business. Now, I think that if we all ran our households and our businesses the way this Congress is now functioning, well, simply put, it's unacceptable. We know better. We know that it's irresponsible and reckless to make the American people pay when we don't get their way, when we don't get our way. We were sent to Congress to represent something bigger than ourselves. We were sent to represent the American people, all of the people, all Americans, not just a privileged few. We represent every military family and every veteran, from the homeless veteran in Birmingham, Alabama, to those serving overseas right now. We represent every child in this great country of ours, from the child who will eat free lunch today because of the SNAP program, to the child here in D.C. who is enrolled in the Head Start program. All Americans. We were elected to be representatives. We need to start earning the title of being a representative by representing all of the people. It's unacceptable that we are in this chamber while the rest of government is shut down. It is unacceptable. I urge, Mr. Speaker, that you bring to this House floor a clean funding bill, unencumbered by unreasonable amendments. Bring a clean funding bill to this floor, and I guarantee you that both Republicans and Democrats would pass that bill, and we would open back up the federal governments. It's important that we put our partisan politics aside and truly start representing the American people that sent us here. Let's be representative of all the people. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from Tennessee, Mrs. Blackburn, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I appreciate the opportunity to address my colleagues today. And indeed, being in the middle of a government shutdown is something we did not want. And we do, my colleagues and I, continue on our side of the aisle, continue to invite the Senate colleagues and their conferees to sit at the table with us and negotiate. We want to make certain that we work out the issues of our nation's fiscal health. You know, we have to remember, currently we're borrowing $2–3 billion a day to keep the doors open. This is something we cannot do. It is not fair. It is not fair to future generations. It is not fair to our children and grandchildren. It is not fair to the small business people who have dreams of building a business, watching that business grow, watching those dreams come true. It is not fair to the future of their families. So to our Senate colleagues, we do continue to ask them to join us and to negotiate these issues. There's a lot that's been said about Obamacare. And some say, well, it doesn't have anything to do with the budget. But you know what, Mr. Chairman, it has everything to do with the budget. Because of the amount of growth that is taking place in this program. I think we all remember that originally Obamacare was to be a health insurance access program. Let's give a pathway for uninsured Americans to have access to health insurance. A laudable goal, something that there was agreement on. But where it ran off the rails, if you will, was in the projections of the cost, far exceeding what anybody ever thought it would be. When it began to make cuts, $600 billion worth of cuts, $600 billion worth of cuts in Medicare, taking money out of Medicare, money that the federal government is taking out of wage earners' paychecks and putting it over into the pot that says Obamacare, and using that money to redirect, to stand up the Obamacare program. There's a problem with that. There's a problem when there are mandates that are made on our hospitals, on our physicians, that are paying them less. There's a problem when there is $819.3 billion of new taxes specifically embedded in the Obamacare legislation, the law. $819.3 billion of new taxes that are going to come out of the paycheck of workers and be put into the Obamacare pot to implement that law. Now, the impact is dramatic. Even though the President has given 1,200 waivers and special favors, even though he's chosen to make 19 delays of the program for people and entities that have gone to him and said, hey, we would like a delay, or we would like a waiver. The list goes on and on and on. It is individuals like my constituents who are dealing with the full impact of this. Here are a couple of the emails that I have received. Marcia, please stop Obamacare from happening. This is a small business owner in one of my cities. It was great for me to have insurance through the Cover 10 program for small business. It works great for me and others. It's affordable. There's no way I can afford Obamacare. My insurance cost is going up 5 times more than what I pay now. We cannot afford this program. A small business owner who went to a check cashing facility, got $400, started a business, now has 5 locations, 45 employees, wants to grow this business and cannot. Because 40-hour work week, 50 employees, it would cause him to have to shutter the doors of his 5 locations and do something different for his 45 employees. That is the impact that this law is having on a regular, daily basis. Another constituent with a child with type 1 diabetes, they have utilized their employer's reimbursement account. $5,000 that was there, now that's going to be limited to $2,500. They are looking at how unaffordable Affordable Care Act is going to be for them. The list goes on and on. I yield back my time.
Gentlelady's time has expired. The chair now recognizes a gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Davis, for 3.5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Speaker, my colleague, Dr. Bill Cassidy, a Republican from Louisiana, and I introduced a bipartisan bill, H.R. 2734, the Garrett Lee Smith Memorial Reauthorization Act, on July 19th of this year. This legislation would reauthorize the Garrett Lee Smith Memorial Act to help state and local governments and universities to continue to provide and develop suicide prevention programs. This current bill is budget neutral and would revise and extend provisions of the original act signed into law by President George W. Bush in 2004. It is named for former Senator Gordon Smith, Republican of Oregon's 22-year-old son, Garrett, whose life was ended in September of 2003. Every year, over 38,000 Americans die by suicide, and many more are treated for self-inflicted injuries that result from suicide attempts. As you may know, suicide still remains the second leading cause of death for adolescents and young adults between the ages of 10 and 24, and results in 4,800 lives lost each year, according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Also, the same agency reported that youth in grades 9 through 12 in public and private schools in the United States found that 15% of students reported seriously considering suicide. 11% reported creating a plan, and 7% reported trying to take their own life. According to the 2010 American College Health Association's National College Health Assessment 2, noted that 45.6% of the students surveyed reported feeling that things were hopeless, and 30% reported feeling depressed. The Garrett Lee Smith Memorial Act Reauthorization Grant Program has assisted 35 tribes, 45 states, and 85 institutions of higher education to develop suicide prevention and intervention programs, which are often the first line of defense for those with this troubling disease of mental illness concerns who are distraught and aren't certain about what to do. Again, H.R. 2734 is budget neutral and I come to the floor to ask all of my colleagues to co-sponsor the Garrett Lee Smith Memorial Act. We can disagree on some things, but I don't think we need to disagree on this. Please sign up as a co-sponsor, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Stutzman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I come to the floor today, Mr. Chairman, to share what I believe is a lack of cooperation in Washington, D.C. Mr. Chairman, I come from Indiana as a farmer who served in the Indiana legislature at times where we had divided government. And my belief is that the only way you're going to solve a problem between when you have issues is to talk. When you have one party who's at the table and is willing to discuss the problems that we face, and you have another party who refuses to come to the table, we're not going to get anything done. The gentleman from New York asked a little bit ago, who is in charge in the Republican conference? Is the Speaker of the House or the Tea Party faction? Well, I'll tell you who I believe is in charge, and that is our Speaker with the authority from the American people who elected each of us to come to Washington to represent them and to fight for them and to fight against an over-aggressive federal government, $17 trillion of debt, and to fight a health care law that only intrudes more and more onto American lives. And as I think about history and the fact that we have been here before, we have been in a government shutdown before, and under those circumstances we had President Ronald Reagan, and who was a Republican, and we had Speaker of the House Tip O'Neill. Well, Speaker of the House Tip O'Neill shut down government 7 different times. 7 different times during President Reagan's time in office. But President Reagan didn't just sit at the White House and refuse to talk. He didn't go out traveling around the country pointing the finger back at Congress. He invited Tip O'Neill down to the White House and sat down over a cup of coffee and talked the problems out. That's what leadership does. Leadership brings people to the table and finds a way to get the problems resolved. You know, we here in the Western Hemisphere, we work, whether it's in business, whether it's in our family budgets, whether it's in our family problems, we try to find a way that both sides can win, because that's how we're going to walk away from the table feeling like we were successful and that we didn't break the principles that we believe in, that we're going to find a way to work together, and that it's going to be a win-win for both parties. But right now, we're seeing that it's going to be a win-lose situation, where President Obama and Senator Harry Reid are going to say, we're going to win and Republicans are going to lose. Because we have sent over 4 different compromises, 4 different proposals to the Senate. And what does the Senate do with them? They table them. They put them on the table and say, we're not going to even negotiate. We're not even going to talk. Now, is that what Tip O'Neill did? Is that what President Ronald Reagan did? Even after 7 times the government was shut down, because what were they fighting over? Speaker Tip O'Neill was actually fighting for the Fairness Doctrine. It wasn't over bigger government spending or more government spending or $17 trillion of debt or a massive, much larger health care program. It was over an ideology. So if we can't even come to the table and talk about the problems that we face today, Washington is going to continue to be broken for a long time. You know, I hear the frustrations from my colleagues about the furloughs. And I sympathize with that because I have constituents in the 3rd District in Indiana who are going to be furloughed, who are furloughed. But at the same time, the American people there have been many Americans who have been furloughed without pay, who don't have work because of the uncertainty that Obamacare has had on this economy. And I believe that it's time that we stand up for the American people rather than for the American federal government and start looking out for the people in this country and saying, we're with you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Expired. The chair now recognizes the distinguished gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Marino, for 3.5 minutes.
I'm certainly not going to be 3.5 minutes at this point. And I had some notes, but that's what I usually do when I get up, the notes go away, and I try and speak from the heart. I've been watching this, and it's very frustrating. And first let me say, there's no one that should go without health insurance. I have a daughter who has a disease for which there's no cure, none whatsoever. She will be lucky to live to her late 20s. So it's critically important that there be a method by which we can get some help to pay for treatment, not only for her, but for every child out there and every human being. But aside from that, I go to the gym every morning at about 6 o'clock, and I work out with my colleagues on the other side of the aisle and on my side of the aisle. The camaraderie is extraordinary. We joke with each other. We help each other in the weight room. We spot each other. We talk about our families. We even talk about politics. But it's civil. And I would really like to see the whole floor see how we operate in the American people, to see how we communicate with one another in that gym in the morning. And I'm asking that every person be civil. We've been called, Republicans have been called Nazis, terrorists, people that don't want to take care of children and seniors, and that's wrong. We can have ideals, we can have a belief, but we need to be civil about it, and we need to give an example and show an example to the American people that we're adults, that we can have different views, and that's what a democracy is about. We don't have to make it personal. We don't have to grandize it to get attention to call names. So I'm saying to my colleagues, I'm reaching across. I have not done that. I will not do it. I will criticize my colleagues if they do it. But let's use this moment to show to the American people that we can have a dialogue, we can have arguments, but to keep it civil, because when the dust is settled, America is going to be better for it, and Congress is going to be much better for it. I yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Pursuant to Clause 12A of Rule 1, the Chair declares that the House is in recess for a period less than 15 minutes.